Laura Hernandez, PhD, is an associate professor with the Department of Animal and Dairy Science. And next up here, Dr. Hernandez will discuss calcium metabolism in the mammary gland and the physiology during the transition period and other factors that the mammary gland needs in order to thrive.
Thank you for having me, all of you, and hopefully this will be a session in which I can give you some information that might be helpful going forward with management on the farm. So in terms of the bovine lactation timeline, as we all know, there's a lactation curve where we have the start of lactation and we're increasing to peak lactation. And then at that point, we have this gradual decline of lactation throughout the course. So this peak milk yield is somewhere between 60 to 90 days. And during this time period, the cow is really susceptible to issues because she's having to mobilize a lot of her tissue to support lactation and maintain her energy balance. Then once we hit this involution period or during the dry off, which would occur somewhere hopefully around 305 days, our cow is pregnant. And we have to give her some time to recover her mammary tissue so that it can repopulate and be ready for the next lactation. Most other species, when they're getting ready to enter their lactation, are not typically concurrently pregnant like dairy cows are. So this is a really critical time period in which we see an increase in mammary epithelial cell proliferation so that she can replace the cells that have likely died off during the course of her lactation with new cells that can be really active and provide adequate milk in the next lactation. We talk about a 60-day dry period, and a little later I'll talk about how that applies to a certain group of cows, but how others can have a shorter dry period of around 45 days to make sure that they're lactating appropriately. So we really need to set up the cow so that during this time period when she undergoes parturition, she's able to have adequate energy as well as an adequate level of mammary tissue to lactate and not have a lot of problems. And that's why we have to focus on this dry period in order to ensure this happening. So these two go hand in hand. You have to have a very good dry period with adequate energy moderation and adequate proliferation of her cells so that when she gives birth, she can really just take off and hopefully not have a lot of issues. So how is this controlled? It's controlled by the brain. So the hypothalamus is going to control a bunch of hormones that are going to be secreted through the anterior pituitary that are going to stimulate things like the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, and the ovary to produce hormones like cortisol, thyroid hormone, estrogen, and progesterone, which are critical during that dry period to replace those epithelial cells. And this has to be done appropriately in order for the cow to have a successful lactation. Additionally, all these hormones act on the mammary gland, but so does prolactin, growth hormone, which we know a lot about from the use of Posilac previously, and insulin-like growth factor 1 that are really going to help stimulate that mammary tissue to produce milk and maintain energy balance, of course. So the other part of this is the posterior pituitary, which regulates oxytocin secretion from the hypothalamus into the bloodstream, of course, to have milk let down. And this pathway is really critical as well to make sure that the milk is being let down rapidly, particularly when we're milking cows. And one thing that does happen over the course of a lactation curve is that the sensitivity of this tissue in the mammary gland decreases to oxytocin, so it takes a little longer for cows to milk out. So one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that once an animal's lactating, the mammary gland controls milk synthesis. And so this is why if you increase milking frequency, you get an increase in milk yield, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But a lot of research has not focused on that. They've been really more focused on the energetic control. And while that's important, it's that stimulus of the milk that is driving the cow to make more milk. And what do I mean by that? So colostrum and milk synthesis is clearly important. And as a result of this, you have an increase in demand of protein from the mammary gland to make milk protein. And so that has to coordinate with the muscle tissue within the cow. And so this increase in protein demand by the mammary gland stimulates either mobilization from the cow herself or more demand by the nutrition to provide protein to the mammary gland. And this then feeds back. You get muscle protein from the hopefully adequate diet, and this goes to the mammary gland to increase milk synthesis. Additionally, this applies to the need of energetics. So you're going to have an increase in mobilization from energy from the adipose tissue. And this will also feed back on the mammary gland to bring either non-esterified fatty acids or beta hydroxybutyrate to make more fat within the mammary gland as well. And this also is interestingly going to drive calcium demand because calcium is the major mineral in milk. And so if you make more milk and you make more colostrum, you need more calcium from the cow. And all mammals need more calcium than the diet can provide, especially during early lactation. And so the bone tissue will have to supply some of this. So this what we call homeostatic control of milk production, you can see here there's the blood supply, and this is the mammary tissue, or the parenchymal tissue as we would call it. And it is going to be demanding a lot of things to make milk. So you have that endocrine control, or those hormones that I talked about, estrogen, prolactin, growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and all those hormones are going to stimulate this mammary tissue to make more milk. But as I said, you have this local control within the tissue that the more you milk the cow, the more demand that the mammary gland is going to pull into the tissue to make milk. And a very obvious input of that would be this increase in milking frequency that you would stimulate more milk production. So to that, there's a lot of research that's been done in this, and because each mammary gland, so in the case of the cow, there's 4 mammary glands, it controls its own milk output. And there's a lot of research actually coming from Doug Ryman, the Dean of Extension here in cows, that has shown that each mammary gland makes different amounts of milk. So each mammary gland is going to control its milk output. And using this half udder model, we've been able to show, lots of researchers have, that each of these mammary glands are separate. And using a half udder model lets us demonstrate that, because you get rid of the genetics, the nutritional and the environmental, and the endocrine variability between animals. And so what you see is that you can undermilk one side and get a decrease in milk yield, like with a 1x milking. But if you milk the other side of the udder 4 times a day, you get much more milk output. So that's been a really classic demonstration of the fact that the more you milk an animal, the more milk you will make. So if you use increased milking frequency, you get an increase in milk production, and this is independent of nutrition, because you can see that using this half udder model. You get an increase in lactation persistency. So what does that mean? As you get that decline in milk yield after you reach peak, you can increase that milk curve a little bit if you do that. And if you frequently milk during early lactation, you can get a response in later lactation that will hold of increased milk yield. And as seen when you switch from a 2x traditional milking per day to a 3x milking per day, you would get about a 10% increase in milk yield over the course of an entire lactation. And this is summarized here from a paper in 1995 by Rich Erdman that shows here that if you have 1x milking, you get about 9.4 kilos per day. And if you go to 2x, it's 15.6. And so this is just a demonstration of something that you can do to increase milk yield if you wanted to. Okay. All right. So this is a demonstration of local factors that regulate this milk secretion, as I said. So you want to, if you increase milk yield, this is being regulated within the mammary gland by a lot of different things. Milking frequency is one way to do this. IGF-1, which, as we all know, if you give Posilac, this would stimulate milk yield, and this is a local regulation. You get an increase in cell proliferation due to that IGF or growth hormone input. And this happens with both IGF-1 and IGF-2, and it stimulates cell proliferation by those mammary epithelial cells, as well as moving them into a secretory state. Serotonin, which is the work we've been doing, has shown that it stimulates or affects milk secretion at the local level as well. This can also be seen when you utilize prolactin, which is a lactogenic hormone. And there are negative regulators like TGF-beta, which can inhibit milk proliferation or cause apoptosis of those cells, which would cause a decrease in milk yield. And you can see that by some of the proteins in the mammary gland if they build up. So if you have too much alpha-lactalbumin or too much casein, you would see a decrease in the proliferation of the mammary epithelial cells. So what is the importance of calcium? Like I said, it's the key mineral in milk, and it's going to drive calcium homeostasis in the cow. It's primarily bound to milk proteins like casein, but it is also exists in a free state. It's really important because it's going to regulate intracellular signaling. So it's going to regulate what the things like the Golgi apparatus and things within the cells and how they function. And how is it regulated? It's going to be regulated by the calcium sensing receptor, which is found on a lot of cells in the body. And it says either the body has not enough calcium or too much calcium, and that's going to regulate what happens. And this is really important, particularly during early lactation. So at parturition, we know that a lot of things happen to the dairy cow. And this is why the dry period is so critical. We have to make sure that she's set up sufficiently to have milk synthesis occurring, and not in a way that's going to cause such a severe negative energy balance or a negative calcium balance or a negative balance in general that can cause her problems. So during late pregnancy, there is an amount of calcium that's being lost to the fetus, but it's only about 80 milligrams per kilo of corrected body weight. But during early lactation, this increases to 500 milligrams. So how we manage this cow during the prepartum period is really important to her calcium status postpartum. And cows on average will delete their calcium pool on an order of 20 to 30 times per day because of the milk calcium demand. So she's trying to manage where does her calcium come from, the diet, the bone, preventing calcium loss on a daily basis or even a minute-to-minute basis. So this picture just shows, this is a picture one of my grad students found that I really like, but the main source of calcium during lactation in any mammal is this bone tissue, because you just can't get enough calcium into her diet to make up for what she needs to make milk. So the skeletal calcium pool in a cow is up to about 19 pounds. So it's a lot of calcium. And you can see here during this early lactation period, just like with energy, there's a negative calcium balance. So somehow we have to support her ability to do this, and we can do that nutritionally prepartum. So what I look at in an early lactation cow is several things that are regulating her ability to come out of this early lactation period successfully without going down or without having something that's going to affect her reproduction or her tissue development in the mammary gland. And there are 4 components to that when I'm looking at this. So we see up here in this line, this is a normal calcemic cow. She gives birth, her calcium goes down and she comes up. This middle line is what we would call a subclinical cow. She becomes subclinically low in calcium, but she starts to come up. And then this third line is a cow that you would see going down. So this is a down cow due to low calcium. So how do we manage that? It's how far this magnitude drop of calcium that occurs at calving. So you can see the differences between these three groups of cows. The other part is how long is she low? So you can see she starts to decline here prepartum. She goes down really hard at calving, and then she has a really hard time coming back, postpartum. Here we're at 3 days and she's still really low in her calcium concentrations. And then this rate of recovery. So if the cow's calcium decreases, how fast can she come out of that? And then her resistance to the drop. So how can we make sure that she decreases to stimulate these factors that are going to drive her calcium maintenance through pulling calcium from bone and controlling her calcium going into milk and making sure she's okay, So what is this resistance? And that also, all of these four things together dictate how she's going to be okay postpartum in terms of becoming potentially ketotic or having metritis or having low pregnancy per AI. So is hypocalcemia a bad thing? And this is what I was getting at. We have these, this is research from Jessica McCart, a veterinarian at Cornell University. And what she showed basically are these four areas in which you can become calcemic. So you have a normal calcemic, you have a transient subclinical hypocalcemia, a persistent subclinical hypocalcemia, and a delayed subclinical hypocalcemia. And when she was looking at her data set, she found that these transient subclinical cows and these normal calcemic cows were the ones that went out into their lactation and made the most milk and were the healthiest. So looking at what a cow looks like in terms of her calcium concentrations at postpartum, one time point isn't going to tell you everything about that cow. And so management of what we do here prepartum is really important. And that goes to the dry period, how you're feeding your cow, how long her dry period is, and how she's going to perform postpartum. So we really have to look at these cows more closely, and a time point isn't going to tell us everything. So this cartoon I know is probably super technical, and it's something I would show in my lactation class, but I wanted to show you basically the takeaway is that in a mammary epithelial cell, there is a lot going on during lactation, and this just pertains to calcium. And there are a bunch of sensors and pumps that are pumping calcium in and out and trying to get calcium into the milk. And all of these pumps are dictating what the cow is doing. And there is a calcium sensing receptor on these cells that make milk, and they tell the cow, I need more or I need less. And then the cow has to respond to that also to keep herself well. And you can see that from the blood side of the cell to the side that's facing the milk, there's a very high increase in the amount of calcium within that cell because that's what's being pumped out. And all of this is telling the cow what she needs to do. So we've been studying how calcium fluctuates into the cell, and we know that this happens. And we're trying to understand how the cell responds. It produces a hormone that is very similar to parathyroid hormone. And this happens only during lactation. And what it's doing is telling the bone cells that we need more calcium, and we have to pull the calcium from the bone cells to restore what happens in the blood of the cow so she can be okay and also produce milk. And we believe that serotonin is contributing to this. And that's the focus of what my research has been. So this gets to this hypocalcemia. The main thing that we know is that calcium is really desperately needed for the muscle maintenance in all animals. So this becomes important because you need calcium for the rumen, you need it for the gastrointestinal tract, you need it for contraction of the uterus, and you also need it for teat sphincter contraction within the teats. So if you don't have enough calcium, it doesn't just cause a down cow, but it has these downstream effects that we don't realize. So if you have depressed rumen and GI motility, you're going to have an issue with feed intake. Therefore, you lead to issues with energy balance, rumen fill, and milk yield. Also, if you don't have enough calcium, you can affect the uterus and then lead to metritis and uterine involution, which is going to affect the reproductive tract. And you can also have effects on mastitis if that teat sphincter isn't being controlled. The other thing that now we're realizing that was known but people weren't paying attention to is that cells that help with immune function called neutrophils use calcium to kill bacteria. So if we don't have enough calcium, we can also have issues with immune function. And all of this pulled together, particularly early postpartum, can result in a ton of problems. And that's where we see a lot of issues in cows. So we really have to make sure that prepartum, we're managing the cow appropriately so that she can be okay in terms of calcium postpartum. So if we take a look at this, again, I'm not going to lie, I stole this from one of my grad students, but I really like it. She showed how calcium was dispersed during these different periods of a cow's life cycle. And what this is that you can see during a pregnancy period, if you're talking about 5 grams of calcium, that's 1 stick of chalk. but you get to peak milk yield, you're talking about a whole box plus 4 extra pieces of chalk. So this is a lot if you put that kind of visual together, that we're going from pregnancy to lactation, and lactation is a completely different time period. So during lactation, there's a lot of calcium flux. You have what's in the blood, you have what's in the bone, and during the first 30 days in milk, you'll lose about 13% of the cow's bone just to keep that supported, because you can't keep enough in using the kidney by preventing calcium excretion, or absorb enough from the gastrointestinal tract to keep the cow homeostatic. And then, of course, dietary calcium is different prepartum versus postpartum, and there's a lot of discussion about how much calcium you should have in a prepartum diet, but we won't get into that today. But if you have questions, I can certainly try to answer them. And all of this is talking about moving calcium into the mammary gland to make colostrum and milk. And so we really have to keep in mind what's happening within the cow to keep herself okay, also while maintaining milk production. So milk synthesis is going to control calcium decline at parturition. And a really elegant study done by Jesse Goff at Iowa State showed that you have colostrum and milk synthesis that's occurring. And you can see that at calving, there's this really severe decline in calcium as a result of that. What they did was they did a mastectomy in cows about 60 days prepartum. So the cows still were able to give birth, but they were no longer going to make milk. And when that happened, you see no change in calcium at calving. So this study shows that the decline in calcium at calving is due to making milk, and that is why it's decreasing at birth. So we have to really keep in mind that this mammary gland is controlling this. So this study shows that basically they were able to take parathyroid glands out of rats, and when they did that during lactation, the plasma calcium levels were the same, whether they had a parathyroid gland or not, as were their phosphorus concentrations, as were their body weights. But what happened was when they took a femur tissue from these and ashed them, they saw that in lactation there was a decrease in calcium in ash in these femurs, regardless if they had a parathyroid or not. So that shows that there was still mobilization of bone tissue from these rats. But during non-lactating animals that had a parathyroid, you can see that they have plenty of ash present. So this suggests to you that something else is going on. They're still mobilizing bone tissue, even though they don't have parathyroid hormone. And we believe that's due to PTHrP synthesis in the mammary gland. So to show you that during lactation, not a non-lactating state, we're just living our lives. We have our parathyroid gland. It secretes parathyroid hormone when calcium concentrations decrease. And what happens is it increases calcium resorption in the kidney so that you don't excrete too much calcium into your urine. It also acts on the gut to increase calcium absorption, as well as stimulate vitamin D production to help aid in this. And PTH also increases vitamin D directly. It'll also increase calcium resorption from bone, but not too much, because in a normal physiological state, you shouldn't need too much from your bone tissue unless you're severely low in calcium. But during lactation, this changes. You still have this mammary gland. What's new is you have a mammary gland making milk, and it also produces this hormone called parathyroid hormone related protein that is very similar to PTH. And what it does is work directly on the bone. So the mammary gland makes it, it dumps it into the blood, and it increases calcium resorption without having to go through any other situations. You still have the parathyroid gland, it still makes PTH, it increases calcium resorption from the urine, and it also increases calcium absorption in the gut and stimulates vitamin D. It's just that it needs, during this physiological state of lactation, we need a little extra help, and the mammary gland helps direct that, like it does a lot of things for energy, protein, etc. So we've shown that when we give this precursor to serotonin, 5-HTP, what it does is increases the amount of calcium going into the mammary gland and more calcium going into the milk. And what this happens is that it helps stimulate production of PTHrP by the mammary gland, so you get more calcium resorption from bone. So it's working and making more use of this negative feedback to drive more calcium availability for the cow or anyone that's lactating. So what we're trying to understand in our lab, along with Milo Wiltbank and JP Martinez, is that can we improve immune function and reduce metabolic disorders to improve colostrum quality as well as reproductive health? And so we're working on using potentially the quality of the colostrum as an indicator of adequate calcium status as well as hopefully adequate reproductive status. And we're doing that in a couple of different ways. So we want to use this as a predictor of positive immune function as well as a reduction in metabolic disorders. So we're looking at how we can intervene prepartum to do this. And so one thing that we're looking at is activation of the homeostatic calcium mechanisms to make sure that the cow doesn't have too low of calcium, through activating bone mobilization a little bit earlier so that the cow is much better when she gives birth. And we're also looking at how we can improve body condition score at calving to prevent negative energy balance. And by doing that, we can integrate this. So our hope is that we can look at colostrum quality and have that as potentially a predictor of immune function as well as reproductive status. And we just got funded to do this. So hopefully we'll be able to start working on this project really soon. And one thing I wanted to show you, because I'm sure a lot of you are looking at how you deal with cows at calving, and I really believe in feeding a negative DCAD at this point to really monitor, to prevent too much calcium depression postpartum. And one thing that we showed was we're trying to show that when you don't allow this decrease in calcium, at least a little bit at calving, you can have negative impacts on the cow. So what we did was we either gave them a negative DCAD diet or a positive DCAD diet, and then right at calving, we infused them with a control of dextrose, and then the other groups got calcium gluconate. So we had negative DCAD cows getting dextrose or calcium at calving, and then positive DCAD cows getting dextrose or calcium at calving. And what I want to show you here, this is really early research, is important, I think, as you're managing cows. So we started about negative 27 prepartum. We were feeding these cows either positive or negative DCAD. And then, so they were given, formulated for minus 120 or positive 120. And then at parturition, well, prior to parturition, so about 4 days, we started sampling these cows every 6 hours for blood and urine, all the way to 3 days postpartum. And then at calving, we gave them either, as I said, a dextrose infusion to control for the calcium gluconate energy, or an infusion of this calcium gluconate. And they were given this about within 15 minutes of parturition. So what we saw, and then we measured milk production and a lot of other things, but I wanted to show you some preliminary data. So what we see is that negative DCAD cows here prior to parturition, so this is hours relative to calving minus 102, and this is the calving time point, is that the negative DCAD cows had higher ionized calcium all the way until parturition compared to the positive DCAD cows. And this starts at about minus 60 hours relative to partum, which is really neat to show that the diet is doing what it should be doing. Then at parturition, what I want to show you here, and this is very confusing, but basically we maintain calcium in the two cow groups. So the positive DCAD are the red and the negative DCADs are blue. And then the negative DCAD cows controlled dextrose are green and the positive dextrose cows are yellow. So you can see these negative DCAD cows getting the control. Their calcium did go down, and then within 36 hours postpartum, the ionized calcium is going back to normal. So they were in great shape. But one thing I want you to show is that if we gave cows calcium for that 24 hours, so we were trying to maintain normal calcemia, they never went below the threshold for subclinical hypocalcemia. The main thing to show you here is these negative DCAD cows getting calcium. They had a delay and decrease once we stopped giving them calcium, but then they really fell behind here in terms of compared to the positive DCAD cows. So it seems like any benefit of the negative DCAD diet when we gave them calcium right at calving sort of reversed the goal here. And then the positive DCAD cows had lower ionized calcium concentration, and the positive DCAD cows getting the calcium had a major crash once we turned off the calcium. So this shows that there is a need for a negative or a decrease in calcium at calving. You just don't want it to be too low. And you can see here with those negative DCAD cows, it went down and they started to recover much quicker than these positive DCAD cows. And this is just a graph showing all of that together. So it really was the negative DCAD control cows that had a decrease at calving, but within 24, 36 hours, they were already starting to increase. So this is just thoughts for negative DCAD works prepartum, and there probably are some issues here around parturition with should you give them calcium or not, and how should you do this? And we're really working on this data set further, but it was pretty interesting nonetheless, which is why I wanted to show you. So now on to the dry period. What do you do during the dry period in terms of how long a cow should be dry? What are all the components going in here? So this diagram here shows you dry off, parturition, and then her first trimester, so to speak, of pregnancy, and her third trimester here. So you're trying to maintain a lot of different things. As I said, you're trying to deal with calcium, you're trying to deal with energy, you're trying to deal with protein, and what the cow should get from a ration standpoint during the dry period. But then you're also dealing with how long should the cow be dry? And this gets back to those hormones that are going to develop that tissue to make sure that the cow can lactate appropriately once she gives birth. And estrogen and progesterone are those hormones that are going to help develop those cells and help them repopulate during the dry period. So one thing we know for sure is that you don't want to continuously milk a cow through her dry period. That has not had any positive effects. So we're trying to deal with all of this. The other thing we know is that you don't want to give a cow too much energy, because if you do that during the dry period, she will get fat and have too much body conditioner on her, and that will cause essentially a train wreck postpartum. So we're trying to balance these things out to figure out what's optimal. So this is work actually that Rick Grummer's lab did here and is published in the Journal of Dairy Science. And there's two things that it shows. And basically you have cows, younger cows and older cows, and they need a different dry period, or they respond better to different dry periods for a reason. So here on the left, we have cows that are in their second parity. So this is second lactation. They're going to enter their second lactation. And these cows were either given a 34-day dry period or a 56-day dry period. And what they showed during the first 100 days in milk are that these cows significantly performed higher when they had the 56-day dry period compared to the 34-day dry period. So 42.5 kilos of milk versus 39. But what was different was cows that were entering their third parity or greater, when you gave them a 34-day dry period or a 56-day dry period, they did not have significant differences in the milk yield during the first 100 days. So cows that are going into their second lactation need a longer dry period compared to cows going into their 3+ lactation. And there's a reason for that. So what happens is there are a bunch of stem cells within the mammary gland. And these cows that have only gone through their first lactation still have a lot of these stem cells present in their mammary gland because they have not finished growing. So they need a longer dry period so that these progenitor cells can become these lactating cells that are going to provide the milk. However, cows in their second lactation entering their third, or third entering into their fourth, they have much fewer stem cell populations. So they don't need as long as a dry period to be exposed to that estrogen and progesterone so that these cells can be committed into lactating epithelial cells. So that's really where the difference is between these. So my recommendation is you can get away with a cow going first into her second lactation. You can't get away with a short dry period. They need their 56 days to really adequately stimulate their lactation and actually make more milk in their next lactation. Whereas the second lactation and older cows, you can shorten their dry period to 35, 40 days and still have the potential to make more milk in their next lactation, because their mammary glands are more mature and they don't need as much stimulation of these progenitor cells to become actual mammary epithelial cells. So in conclusion, this is a diagram. I wrote a book chapter for the large herd dairy management book. For those of you who haven't seen that book, it has a lot of great information, not just about this with Bob Collier and Jeff Dahl, but we've done a lot since the 1960s in terms of science. And we can utilize this information to help us, whether it's to decrease lactation in animals, like in a time period such as we are, but also make sure that the cows will be able to perform in their next lactation. And we've seen that even in response to having to take RBST out as a management tool. And as a result of that, you can see we have a much higher milk curve compared to then. And that doesn't even include doing really anything except managing photoperiod, selecting for genetics, increasing milking frequency, in these different periods of the lactation curve, and managing dry period length. So with that, I'd like to thank all of my students and Bob Collier, especially, who was my PhD advisor, in bringing all this research together. So I hope that information can provide you some good knowledge to help manage different farms, especially as we are in the times that we are. And I can take any questions now or always later. I'm always available and happy to help.